Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first, oh my gosh, it just sounds so great to say it. Our first art play class, number one, numero uno. I am so excited to be here and so excited that you guys can join. I thought about so many things that I wanted to do today, but I think the most important thing is just get right to painting, right to drawing, right? So we're going to do a little bit of both, but mostly I want to celebrate a medium that I use every now and then. I need to use it more often, actually, because every time I use it, I feel like I think, I need to use this more often. I need to bring it with me on location. It's great for studio, and that is gouache. If you've never used gouache before, it's exciting to use because it's a great medium to use, very versatile and very vibrant and dynamic. The best thing about it is you can bring it along with you, just like watercolors. Really, the only difference is think of it as an opaque watercolor. That's the best way to describe it. So for this first class, we're going to be introduced. I'm going to introduce you to a wonderful and versatile medium that is gouache. I'm going to guide you through a step-by-step painting of these water lilies from a botanical garden, which is one of my favorite things to paint. And this class is perfect for beginners and intermediate creatives, just like you and artists alike. So this will be fun. It'll be a fun challenge. I've had a challenge. I mentioned in the brief that I have a challenge for the class. So hopefully you brought some tools with you. You don't need to bring so much. Just your basic gouache set is fine. Some of the primaries is fine. But the challenge for the class is this. So I'm going to go to the desktop. All right. So let's switch there. Let's see. Whoops, lost it for a second.
I can see your desktop, Jed.
Okay, great. So let's go there and I'll show you. There we go. Some of the brushes I'm going to use. Now, the challenge I wanted to have is just a single brush. Now, that sounds really, really challenging, but trust me, it works because the idea is that you're not so concentrated on rendering something and you focus on the painterly aspect of the medium. And that's really important is you get really into the medium, you get to know the medium more. So the brush I'm going to pick, I'm going to have a couple just for backup, just in case, but I think I'm going to use this brush. It's a nice general brush. It's a flat brush. You don't have to use one brush if you want, but it's a really good challenge, and I'll show you why it's a great idea to use just a single brush, right? And I have my acrylics. I have some my gouache paints. I have some various gouache paints here. I'm going to use mostly primaries because I love to mix the paints instead of pulling it right from the tube or right from the paint set. I have my water, right? I also have this, it's a little spray bottle thing, but you know what? I don't know if I'll need it because that's really more for watercolors. So let's get right to it because we have this beautiful, beautiful reference that I love to paint. As soon as I saw this reference, I immediately thought this is going to be perfect for our gouache class. So if you want, if you're not comfortable with going straight to the painting, so let's pace ourselves, okay? So most important thing is that you don't feel like you have to rush and keep pace with me because I do I do move pretty quickly, pretty efficiently. So you don't have to keep pace with me because you can go back and watch the recording uh, again. So just go your own pace. Your own pace is right. And I want to show you, let's see, if you want, you can draw, you can make a little composition first with some graphite or colored pencil. Probably colored pencil is best. But if you're using graphite, just keep it light. So let's put this palette. I have this little palette paper that I use for my gouache. And I have my watercolor paper here. This is a cold, or sorry, a hot press watercolor, which just means it's really smooth. And I like that smoothness to the paper uh, because I like drawing on paper as much as I like painting on it. And it's a nice thick paper. It can hold water medium. So make sure that you have a thicker piece of watercolor paper so that way it can hold your medium quite well. All right. So if you like, what you could do is do a little bit of a composition and don't worry too much about it because that's the great thing about gouache is that it's very much opaque. So it sits on top of a lot of things that you're going to be drawing. And let's simplify this composition. I think the most important thing is I want those lotus flowers to be the main character. And that's really important to consider as well when you're painting. So let's focus on that. So let's keep it nice and small. Let's make the border right about here. If you want, you can use artist tape to make a nice frame. That's not a bad idea. Right, so let's make a nice kind of horizontal composition with our pencil. And this will keep things nice and small. That way, we have enough time to compose the whole piece and to paint the whole piece. So that's a good size, right? And it's in proportion to the reference. And like I said, I want to make sure to draw and to paint the main characters, and that's the lotus flowers. I see the two on the right, I think would be perfect for what we're going to paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little shape that I see just right around the flowers, just so I know approximately where those flowers are going to be. It's the whole composition is going to lean to the right, so that way it's a nice vertical that is to the right, and it's not too perfectly square, perfectly divided in half. So let's go ahead and draw those lotus flowers right in the foreground and just do a nice simple contour drawing with your pencil. And that's just the outside edge of the flower. Zoom in closer so you can see it there. There we go. And then the stem. And feel free to kind of exaggerate the subject matter. If you don't, if it's too small or too big, you can kind of rearrange it and do a little bit of contortion to make sure that it fits in your composition that you'd like. Right? And then that's going to be the water right there. And then there's a few lily pads. So we'll go ahead and put in some of the lily pads right around there just for composition. Like I said, I'm not gonna take it too literal as far as where things are structured, but I'm gonna make my own composition to make it more interesting. And you could do that as well. You can focus on another part of the reference as well. So here's a nice shape. I think it's important to draw them in perspective because the angle of what we're looking at is looking at it from a lower angle. And here I'm going to move this just slightly left. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what I mean when I say you can kind of change the composition a little bit just to suit your needs. And let's add another lily pad right there. So that makes sense. And this is the bigger one. So I'm going to draw just a nice bigger shape like that, just to kind of round it out, right? Because remember that the gouache sits right on top of any of these pencil lines, so you don't have to worry about seeing them. And this is really just to design this entire page to make a nice composition. Let's do a nice contour drawing, just the outside edge of the subject, just like that. Okay. And now I'm deciding right now if I want that background to be dark. And the thing to consider about gouache is that it's really very forgiving because it's very opaque. But we have to be careful because I made that mistake when I first started using gouache. I thought it was, very similar to acrylic paint or oil paint, where it's really, really opaque and you can just about layer colors on top of one another and you don't have to worry about any of the colors coming through. Well, with acrylics, you can still, add some glazing. You can use transparent acrylics. And that's going to give you some more transparency in the medium. But with gouache, if you use something that's very dark, for example, if you have a dark background like this and you want to paint the background dark, or in this case, if you want to paint something light in the background and you put something dark in the foreground, it's not as easy to make it opaque. You will see a little bit of the color in the background. So you have to be careful with that. But I'll show you because we'll go through that because I'm deciding right now if I want that background to be as dark as it is. I think we'll do a little bit of a painterly sort of feel to it. And here, this flower just comes up and around. This will be smaller, just like that. And just a few lily pads up there, just to round out the composition. Go. And that's looking nice. So this is nice and even here, but I want to balance it out on this side as well with some pads, with some lily pads. So right on the left here. And I'm probably just going to taper off the composition just when it hits to the bottom here. So like I said, you can go right into painting if you want, if you're comfortable with it. And you just paint right along with me because you don't have to do this preliminary kind of sketch. But I'm doing it for you guys that want to kind of compose the page a little bit and design the page a little bit. Okay. And maybe just a few in the background here, just a small pocket of them. Kind of give it some perspective, for example. Right, just off in the distance, just like that. Right, do we want to add these other lotus flowers here in the middle? I don't know, we'll see. We'll see what happens when we paint it. So that's pretty good, that's looking good. That's a nice composition. You can see where I kind of moved just a few things around. But overall, it's a great composition to work with. And I just made a few adjustments, all right? So let's get to painting. I'm gonna take my palette paper here. And so this works too, if you have like, kind of a go-to palette. Stay Wet palette's always nice. That's, it's got a sponge at the bottom. And that's good to have because if you're working in the studio, for example, it stays wet for several days, right? So let's add some colors here. We have some primary colors here. We have this cobalt blue and phthalo blue. And I'm just gonna be generous with it. Now I like to mix my paints. You'll see why, because I can really customize my colors, and it's just a personal preference. And I also like to let the colors kind of run together and kind of bump into each other and kind of overlap. And, one thing I love about gouache is that it feels kind of a mixture in between a watercolor and um, an acrylic. So it can be as opaque and as transparent as you like. There's some green. Got a few different shades of green is important, but we can still make that with some of the yellow that we have. So let's do that. And that's the great thing about having primaries, is that you can just kind of mix colors together to make your own palette. And this is a good idea, is to make swatches in advance if you like. And that'll really help you kind of pick and choose what color palette you're going to have. But I like to be spontaneous. I add a lot of spontaneity into my work. I feel like I learn a lot that way when I'm very spontaneous. It also helps me to accept what most people would probably consider mistakes. I kind of welcome them, if that makes any sense. I know that sounds silly to say, but sometimes I welcome mistakes because, um, as an artist, you kind of deal with all kinds of unknowns and all kinds of challenges, and that makes it interesting for me. And also that I like to treat them as, just an okay, just an, kind of a general thing that happens when you're making art, mistakes or any kind of things like that. It's going to happen. And if you accept them and you're willing to just let it go and just go with the flow, and you work more naturally that way. So I love that feeling of working more naturally and accepting the challenge of what most people would consider a mistake. And the white, any kind of white paint you have, it's really, because gouache is pretty opaque, you can kind of save it for last. And the other thing is I don't like to use black. I don't have anything against using black paint, but I love making dark colors and replacing those darker colors with, with any kind of natural color. Right, so this is a good choice here. We can kind of mix and match. And let's start. I want to start with just that one brush. So that's going to be the challenge for me, just a single brush, just so that I get nice and painterly. I don't get too obsessed with detail because I want to really just enjoy the colors and just mixing them. So take a little bit of water. The great thing about gouache is you don't have to add too much water, right? Just a little bit. So I'll show you. You don't want to, you just dip the brush in there and take out most of the water from the brush. That's important, right? And then when you mix the paint, right, let's start with just kind of a medium blue here. So you could see it's got a nice kind of creamy texture to it. That's the texture you want when you're using gouache. And that's what I love about it. It's really buttery and creamy, and the pigment just flows so evenly, right? And I want to add a little bit of red to this because I love a little bit of purple in the water, but I don't want to go too dark too fast, right? So I'm going to use that color. I love that color. That's a great color. Let's move this off to the side and let's just start. And I'm going to have, I love that light value that's coming from the left side, kind of as a diagonal. So keep that in mind when I'm painting. But for now, I'm just going to use this one brush and just go right into it. And the great thing about gouache is it's kind of like with oils is you don't have to be too exact. You should be a little bit more, just a little bit more deliberate though with gouache than oils, because oils, it's very opaque and the color just sits right on top of each other. So I do want to make sure that I'm keeping just a nice edge to the drawing, to some of the shapes here, just to keep the shapes intact. But it's very forgiving, so you can go right into them if you want. If that's okay, you don't have to worry about being too perfect. That's the great thing about using gouache, because you'll see when we add any other layer of color, it sits on top of that color just fine. Okay. And I've done this one brush kind of technique before, and it's pretty fun. I think that when I do it, I've done it enough to where I no longer feel like it's any kind of tough challenge. It's really more like play. And that's really important when you incorporate play into your work. You try to figure out any way that you can kind of explore different things and different ideas, and just keep it interesting. And the main reason is that I feel like I learn a lot. That's why I kind of give myself these little challenges. And kind of work your way around here and just using the edge of the brush. That's going to keep my brush stroke nice and just free and honest. I don't have to worry about rendering nice and painterly, for example. You can see how far this color goes with just a little bit of water and a little bit of pigment, right? So you don't have to have that much water in there. A little bit of red to refresh that. And that sketch in the background, it's really just a guide, right? You don't have to be true to it the entire time. The most important thing is it gives you an idea where approximately where things are going to be. Because when you're painting, I'd like you to just be kind of free about it and to not treat it so clinical and not be so tough on yourself. Really, it's most important thing is that you're just playing around with the pigment and learning about the pigment and what it can do, and most importantly, what kind of creative things you can do when you're painting. That's what I love about painting, because it's never the same thing twice. It's never the same experience. Oh, that blue is beautiful. So every once in a while, I'll do this. And the other thing is that gouache dries pretty immediately, right? So the other thing I like to do is with the same brush, we have this nice blue, for example, I'm going to add just another color that's a little bit darker, right? Or just another variation of that color with a little bit more red to kind of warm it up a little bit. You see the difference there? Right? And that's going to show, it's going to be shown in the brush strokes. And the cool thing is you can now add a different kind of variation of color into what you just painted, right? So it immediately creates that other tone of color. It's very nice. You can just kind of add that to the other sections if you like, just to keep things nice and painterly. And I love seeing the brush strokes with my work. I won't cover the whole thing. I just like the different variations in tone where the light hits the water. And now we can just go back to the other part. I'm going to move this over so you can see the whole thing. All right, so let's get to painting, covering this section here. The other thing about just using a single brush is that you get a lot of coverage if you're just practicing. I do a lot of practice. I like to treat every single piece of work as much as I can as practice, because when I'm practicing, my state of mind is really to experiment and to accept whatever happens and to make adjustments to it. I feel like I'm more open to making those adjustments when I'm just practicing. The same thing with drawing. It's the same thing with a lot of the things I'm going to be showing you for art play is we're just going to get good at practicing, right? Whether you play music or you paint, whatever it is that you do, it's just practice. And we're not seeking perfection, because I know that's the old adage, is practice makes perfect. But really, what we are seeking, if we're seeking anything, it's just learning. That's my favorite thing to discover when I practice, is what have I learned here? And that's something that just you can grow with that, and it makes your creativity and your imagination and your art process just grows with it exponentially. So I'm just kind of mixing and matching. I'm kind of combining the two different tones of blue that we have, right? Some with a little bit more red and some without. And just covering most of the section here with this blue. And I'm going to add a little bit more red to it, a little bit more water. It's funny, I haven't needed to add any more water to the brush, but barely. because it's just so creamy, this gouache paint that I have. And some of them are different. You might want to experiment with some of the different types of gouache, because some of them work a little bit more like acrylic, and some of them are acrylic base, for example, and some of them are a little bit thicker, like the kind I'm using. That's my preference, really. You see how, because I'm using a single brush, I am not worried too much about details or anything being too clinically perfect, right? Because that's kind of how I want this painting to feel. I want it to feel nice and natural and just really free and more spontaneous, really. There we go. That's covering most of it there. Make quick work of it. You can see where I put a little bit of red in there that in the foreground and gets it nice and warm. Go. And then in the distance, I'm going to make that lighter so it trails off into the distance. So it looks like it's farther away. So I'm going to make it less intense and a lot cooler blue. So I'm going to add some white to our blue. Right. And I have to tell you, it's such a beautiful day today in the city in New York. I'm based in New York, and it's very spring-like. It's reminding me that spring is just on the horizon. And the weather today, along with what we're painting, is really making me think about spring and how fun it's going to be to paint in spring. And now that we have the light color pigment on the brush, right? So it's keeping it very spontaneous. I love how this looks now. You can see the brushwork in it. I can now take advantage of that light color and use it for the reflections, for example. So I'm going to add a little bit of that just in the water, just to give some reflection. And really, it's more of a impressionistic, if you will, expressionistic kind of approach with the paint. I know that the water in the reference looks like it's still, but I love things that move and have energy. So I'm going to make it look like the water's flowing a little bit and kind of moving a little bit, got some life to it. Just in a few spots, because you can add more later on. You don't have to worry about doing too much now, right? So let that layer sit. I love how this looks already. You could see how spontaneous and how loose it feels and very painterly how it feels. And that's just, using really just our blue and maybe one other color with the red to make a couple of variations of that tone and a single brush. How's that, right? So let's let that blue, mostly blue, the water kind of sit for a little bit. And while that's happening, I'm going to clean my brush. And here's the interesting thing is I didn't bring any rags with me or paper towels. And that's another challenge that I'm embracing right now because it's going to keep my brush nice and true. So single brush, no wiping it off because you don't have to have that much water on it. I'm just cleaning the brush, just, you know, wiping off the excess water, just like that, right? And I can go right into the next part of it. And I don't even have to wipe it down. So this tells me what I'm learning today is that I can bring this medium with me if I'm working on location, right? And that's really important because having another option for painting on location is always a plus. right? So let's move this over because I can't decide if I want to paint those the lotus flowers first or the lily pads first. So let's go ahead and make some green. Let's go do the lily pads first. And let's just make some green. And a couple of variations of green, right? We have kind of a cooler yellow and a warmer yellow. So that's going to be interesting. Let's move this over just like that. Right, so I'm going to make a darker green. Add a little bit of red to that. That's looking good. A little bit of blue. Great. Just like that. Okay. And then this, we can just make a lighter green, mostly yellow. So there we have two variations, right, of green that we want to use. Right, so this might get a little bit, let's add a little bit more pure color in there. There we go, that's better. All right, so let's go right for it. And some of the spots here where there's bands of color where some is dark and some is light, you can just kind of pick and choose where you want the light to be displayed. So, but don't worry too much about it. Just get right to adding this green in some of the spots where you feel like it's going to be darker. But the most important thing is to maintain the shape integrity of some of the shapes that you've drawn. Right, so let's take our time and just do one lily pad at a time. And sometimes I like to kind of jump around, so that way that leaves me with some time for it to dry, so I won't muddy it and I won't kind of spread out that shape altogether. And I don't know about you, I'm having so much fun doing this. I could just, do this all day, which I do. And this is kind of like, this is what it's like if you're sitting in the studio with me. It's really just, what can we do today to kind of experiment with our mediums, with our tools. And today is all about, I want to do this very painterly looking gouache painting with a single brush. I thought that was going to be fun. I've done it before, I haven't done it enough. I'm adding a little bit of yellow to this nice green, this darker green that we have, just to kind of differentiate the two pads. I'm gonna add a little bit more yellow in there. Because it's so creamy on the brush, it really just sits on top of the color. It sits on top of that color so well, right? So you could see a little bit of the yellow on there. And because it's nice and opaque, we can add some highlights or some dark tones and shadows underneath it. I'm sorry, on top of it when we're putting down that local color. It's looking good. And here I'm going to add even more yellow just to advance this green a little bit and to also differentiate it from its neighbor. Right? Right? Just you could see just a little bit of highlight there really separates the lily pad. That's really what's important. If you're not sure about that, just hop around and don't work within this group because the colors can kind of mix together and kind of muddy each other. So we can kind of hop around if you want. And the other thing that happens too when you do that the benefit to doing that, to kind of spreading around a little bit, is the entire piece kind of comes up together, kind of comes to fruition. The entire piece is usually pretty balanced because you're painting the entire piece and it's elevating together and coming up at the same time. I want to spread this out a little bit so it looks like it's a little bit bigger than some of the other shapes there. Right. I'm just moving right along. And so far, I haven't added any water to the brush. There's all of the water is in the paint that I've mixed so far. So I haven't had to add any water whatsoever. And here's where we want to be a little bit careful, a little bit more careful, because I do want to maintain the shape of the lotus flower and the stem. Right now, if this is for oil and maybe even acrylic, if you're using an opaque kind of wash, then you can kind of go right over it if you'd like. But with gouache, even though it is pretty opaque, it's good to kind of maintain the structure of things and paint around them because it's not as opaque as the other mediums, right? But it is very forgiving. Like we can make changes to the details and kind of rearrange things somewhat. So I'm going to use this lighter green now, I think, because I'd like for it to have some different tones. So I'm adding a little bit more of that lemon yellow. And eventually when this dries, you can see where this is going. I'm going to add some more highlights to it. It's so far so good. And I'm not worried because you have to, you have to think about the process and really just trusting the process, right? Most people, most artists that paint quite regularly, we'll call this, we have a funny name for it, and it sounds really bad, but it's kind of done in humor. We call it the ugly stage. And the reason why we call it that is because most people who aren't used to painting a lot will kind of give up, right? How unfortunate is that? We'll give up because they'll get to this stage where things kind of look like they're in disarray. They look a little bit disheveled or maybe messy. And it's kind of funny, but it's if you trust the process and know that there's a reason things are that way and they're going to go a certain way, and if you just keep going and you trust it, you believe it, it's going to get better. And there's a reason for all these other layers that are happening that really enhance the final touches, really where you're going, right? So it may look a little bit chaotic and messy. I don't like that. I don't like calling it ugly stage. I kind of enjoy this part of it because I know where it's going. And at least for the most part, I think I know where it's going. But I like the surprise. I like the different kind of nuance to it. I like that it's a different sort of adventure every time. It feels like an adventure, really, because it's kind of an artistic journey, really, that you go through every time. And it's never the same thing twice. Right? And you can see I'm just making slight adjustments with the brush, right? And it's creating a lot of different shapes just by kind of tilting the brush. No water so far. I didn't even think we need water today. So we're down to one brush and no water. Can we do this? I can do this with no brush. No, that's a bit too zen-like. We definitely need to use a brush. I just want to add, if you're not using a flat brush, you can use a pointed brush. That's also a really good brush to use for this type of exercise. you can get a little bit more detailed with it, and a little bit more exact. And of course, there's the size of the brush and the type of brush stroke that you're looking for. That's really the important thing with me, is that it's all about the mixing of paint, the medium, and exploring what it can and can't do, what the possibilities are with the paint. That's the most important thing. And keep it nice and loose like this. I love the feeling of this so far. Isn't it looking great? I love this section right here. I think it looks great. That's exactly what I was imagining it was going to be. And we have some in the background there. I'm going to keep that nice and cool and keep some of the warmer color tones in the foreground. I think that's important. So I'm going to maintain those touches of yellow, and even in this foreground here, we might add some red, right? Just to give it even more warmth in the color and to bring out some vibrancy in the color as well. Right, so here we can add just a splash of red, right? Look at that. I love how this looks. See? Look at all the different tones of green that we have. And here I'm just adding just a little splash of red, just like that. Just so that we can add it to just the edges, just the edges. It's right on the tip, like that. Isn't that nice? Just like that. And I like that so much. This is part of this part of discovering things about painting that I love so much. It's the ooh, wait a minute. That's kind of neat feeling that you get. Right? So that's just a little bit of red there that we've added in the foreground. Just a little tiny bit, not too much. Right, so it's kind of mixing together. So I'm going to make sure to clean my brush now. Wow, we get to add water. So you want to be considerate of the other colors, because if you start mixing them, blending them, they start to get muddy. And all that really means is you lose the primary, really the vibrancy of the color, the natural pigment of the color, the brightness of the color, however you want to describe it. It starts to lose that when it mixes together, right? And start to make the colors uniform. It's good to kind of juxtapose the colors, right? To add one color to the other and just kind of have them be neighbors and have them be neighborly. Right? So now we can add the rest of this green that's warmer. Give this section here a little bit more structure. Right? But I like how it looks like it's moving. It looks like it's alive. That's what I love about this kind of painterly feel to the work. And the stem I'm saving because that's altogether a different color. It looks like it's a very light green. So I'm going to make that a different green just so that it stands out. That's the most important thing about that. Right? Great. I love that. Okay, so let's add now, off in the distance, there's some lily pads right there. I'm not going to make that warm because that's going to come forward if we do that. I'm going to add just a touch of blue to this green, just a little bit. Let me show you. Right. That's going to cool it down a little bit. There we go. That's nice. And then I'm just going to add some of the shapes that I see there. One at a time. You don't have to do the whole thing as a blob because that's what it's going to look like. Right? Just kind of draw it with the brush. And for this particular brush, because it's a flat brush, I can kind of use the side of it, use the thin part of it. It's a cooler green, and the shapes are smaller and a little bit less defined, right? So that's important because just like how we see things in reality, things get a little bit softer when we see things off in the distance. And the further off they are, the more blurred, the more soft it is. We're kind of replicating that, right? A little bit darker. Just some touches of it. Just so that we have less light up there and a little bit more shadow up there. Just like that. Right? That looks great. I love that. It's coming together. Look at this. Like you can kind of see where it's going, especially right around this area here. I don't know what I love more, the water reflection, the way it looks like it's moving, all the different brush strokes, or all these lily pads, just a different color of the lily pads, right? And so because I have this green on here, I'm going to go ahead and just touch up some of the lily pads that we've done here in the foreground. I'm going to leave this alone because I like how that looks. That looks like it's off in the distance. That's the most important thing. And since we have the green on the brush, right, and we have all of these nice variations of green here, I'm going to now create some lighter tones, right? Some lighter tones to kind of bring out, kind of flesh out some of these shapes, some of the different varieties. And of course, to add a little bit more light into the painting. So just a tad, just a smidge of water on the brush, right? It doesn't have a lot. You see, it's not dripping at all, right? That's how very little water I have. And that's how creamy the gouache paint is. I'm going to add some yellow to the green that we had. So just maybe two variations of green, really. And some white, just a little bit of white, just to make two variations of it. There we go. Right, so here we have, you can see we started off with these two greens, just a darker kind of medium and a more natural green. And here we're working with some of the lighter values now, right? And then maybe just a straight yellow with just a little bit of that mixed in, right? So now I want to focus on maybe creating a light beam that comes down onto these two lotus flowers, right? So I'm going to touch up these areas here with hit these areas with some lighter values to make them shine a little bit. Not too much, right? The key is just really just to touch it up just a tad in some areas, and that's really how you're going to make the light look like it's hitting in a certain way. See just a little bit of that lighter color, how that looks. And then, so I'm using really just variation of a creamy sort of yellow and white. There. Just like that. And it looks like the light is reflecting. Isn't that great? Just add a little bit more water. When you use a dry brush technique, we can get into that too in another class, but you know, you see a little bit more of the brush work. So for example, you see a little bit more of the texture of it, right? You can see the brushwork a little bit clearer. And that's the advantage to using a lot less water and using a little bit more of a dry brush method. And just a few bits here and there, kind of round out the shape and give it a little bit of detail. That's important. And here I'm just using just a very, very tip of the brush to do that. I'm kind of pick and choose like I'm doing here. I'm just kind of using it to define certain edges, right? I like that. I think I don't want to go too overboard with the highlights, because you can always add them later and you can always take a closer look later on, and something kind of good, generally good happens when you walk away and come back to it and see what happens. And since I have all of this color on the edge of the brush, I can use the very tip of it to just do a dark highlight, just one darker shade highlight, since I have this nice green on the brush already, right? So a little bit more blue, a little bit more red, creates that nice dark tone to our color, right? And I'm going to use that to just touch up the edges here. Look at this, right? Just the very tips of things, just to give it a little bit more definition to the edges of things. And this is where, like I said, you can do this to your heart's content. You can kind of play around with the different tones to create different highlights, different values. And I'm really just using primaries. I'm just mixing and matching. It's so fun to mix colors and get familiar with your colors and your paints, because you'll know how to execute whatever ideas you have, right? If you want something darker, you just, mix that and you know exactly how to do it. I'm just making a little bit more enhancements here and there just to kind of touch it up a little bit and define the edges a little bit, not too much. There we go. There, I like that a lot. It's coming alive, and it's just, it's moving so efficiently. And that's really, if you look at it, it's really coming together as very uniformly. It's all coming together. All the pieces are elevating together, and that's how I know a painting is really going well. The funny thing is I forgot this section here, so since I have the green and coincidentally, it's cool colors, let's go ahead and add that. That's actually a perfect color that I wanted for this foreground. Because in reality, this is going to be warmer, right? Because that's right there in the foreground, but I don't want it to be at the forefront. I don't want it to be the main character of the piece. I want this area right here to be the focus, the primary focus. So I'll just soften that up just like that. There we go. And then this last area right here. If you have artist tape, you have some of the green or blue artist tape, it's really good because you can tape the frame nicely. And when you're done, it makes a nice edge to it and it won't lift the paint. That's really the advantage of artist tape, by the way, in case you're wondering. All right, so now let's give this time to dry. And we're looking at almost towards the end of our session, and this is right on time. It's just right on pace with it, because now we can really embellish this area right here where the flowers are, right? So I'm going to clean my brush, and we're looking at really just three colors. I mean, if we don't count white as one of the colors, we're really looking at just two colors. We're looking at a fuchsia or pink and a kind of a lilac color. So really just pink or fuchsia, whichever one you want to use, and a lilac. That's really the two colors that I'm seeing with those lotus flowers. So let's do that. Let's mix those colors together because we've been so good at doing that. And interestingly, that's gonna leave us time. Let's leave this time to give it some time to dry some of this stuff that we painted already. So I'm gonna turn this over this way and just kind of move it off just very quickly to the side, just so you can see what I'm doing. And got rid of all of the paint on the brush and just cleaned it up. You can see there's barely any water on there. And first thing I'm gonna do is just gonna make a nice pink. So we have this white right over here. Let's turn it this way so you can see it. There we go. And just soften it up a little bit. Doesn't need to be a bright white, obviously, because we're gonna make a nice pink and a fuchsia. That's perfect, right? It's actually really good. That's right amount of color there. That's right in the middle, right? If you're gonna paint something that has some darker tones, a darker pigment of this actual color here and a lighter version of this, it's good to just create the color that's in between. That's the general color, really. Think of it as the major note, right? In a composition, this is really the biggest area of coverage of color that we have. And then we're gonna have a lilac, but let's do that after because I don't want to mix up the paint. So let's cover some of these areas with this pink, right? So let's go back to our painting. It's looking great. And here's where I get some of that pink that I have. And just using the tip of the brush, this is probably going to be the most challenging for me because I've just using this one brush, but that's okay. We're up to it, right? I like this. I actually like that this challenge is here because it makes me enjoy the painting aspect of it more than the rendering aspect of it. I'm not too concerned with something looking that perfect or that close to perfect because I know that I can't. I know that if I had enough time, if I really spent much time, I had all the time in the world and I wanted to really embellish this, I could make it really look pretty realistic, right? We had a lot of time. But I like the spontaneity of the way that we're painting here today. I like that it feels free and we're not too clinical about it, right? That's my favorite kind of painting. There we go. That's a nice general color there for the pink, right? And this bottom area here is more lilac and white, so I'll leave that alone. But there are some areas of pink in this overall painting that I'm seeing. And also just because I like to use some of the color that I've added just for touches. So I might use some of this pink, for example, on some of the stem, right? And maybe even some of the different vines that you're seeing in the water. For example, there's one that comes around and turns over like so. And there's some glimpses of some vines that go right into the water and kind of disappear off into the water, right? That's pretty. And some right here that we can add just touches of it. I realize I didn't paint this area blue, but that's okay. No worries. Right? And then maybe just a few bits here and there, just like that. And inside some of the petals, there is a little bit of pink that we can kind of share the love with this color. I love this color, right? And a few areas here where the water is a little bit more transparent, you could see some stems here and there, just kind of bouncing around, revealing themselves here and there. And there's a few more that kind of float off. Not too much. Just like that. Just some reflections of it. Right? Now, I'm gonna add some white to this pink. I'm not gonna go immediately to the lilac because I already have this pink on the brush and I want to use the same color on the brush. So I'm going to get some white and add it to this pink that we have. Now the rest of it is going to be pretty light. And I'm going to use a little bit more white because we're going to get that lilac color, that nice light violet that we see. And put it right back in the frame. There we go. Now, so we have this pink already, and just kind of going away from where we've just painted, just off in the distance, maybe cleaning the brush a little bit and get most of, but not all of that pink off of the brush. You can see there's a little bit left on there. I'm going to go ahead and make this lighter color. Helps to put down the white so that way. Put down the palette so I can actually mix it well without it bouncing around. So mostly white on there, right? That's what we want. All right. Just like that. And now we can add this to some of the interior parts of it. Right? Like some of the petals that point up behind, like so. And some of the white in the interior. Right? And I'm just using the very, very tip of the brush. And that's, you know, the other benefit to doing it this way with just a single brush. I can keep the strokes nice and painterly and loose and free and not too tight, right? So that looks great. I love how that's soft. It's got a nice soft feel to it. And I don't want to do too much to it because it is off in the distance, right? So now we can use the similar kind of white, very soft pink, and we can go ahead and add it because we have that color now. Now we're going to go away because this from this flower because it's the only one that has that amount of pink or fuchsia in it. Now we can add this mostly white, almost all white. Let's see, I'll make sure, make this a little bit. There we go. So you can see the color a little bit better. Now, even though most of it is this very similar white, I'm still going to treat it with the brush like each petal is kind of a different shape. And the reason is because that's going to keep the overall integrity, the integrity to the whole structure, the whole drawing really is going to maintain that shape. And that's important. And this is going to be darker. And so if we're going to have dark on top of light, that's going to be all right. That's actually fine. So we don't have to, whoops, lost my reference there for a second. There we go. So we're going to have dark on top of light. That's okay. So we can add this light behind it. And since we're there, right, we can go ahead and add the stem that comes down, right? Since we're there, just a touch, right? There we go. Right? So now I'm going to clean this brush because what I'm going to add are those variations of lilac, the violet here, and then the darker green, if you will, a darker green or darker blue if you want. But we're going to keep that color a warmer tone of the petals there in shadow. and underneath just the bottom of the blossom, right? The base of the blossom, and then the stem is a little bit darker, right? So we don't need that pink anymore. We're pretty much done with that. So we're gonna clean the brush, still just using one brush. Can you believe it? I can't believe it. How far we've gone with just one brush. Imagine if we had 10 brushes. What could we do with 10 brushes? So the surprising thing, it's not so much a surprise to me. I've done this before. Really, the revelation here is that the more brushes I use, the more paints I use, the more complicated it gets, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that, if you want to kind of simplify things and streamline things and really be in the moment when you're painting, and that's my favorite kind of painting is when I'm in the moment and I'm just, having fun and loving the process and just enjoying the process. That's what it's all about for me. So let's add, I'm going to set this aside for a second because I want to add some white to our palette. I trust that the bottom of this is going to be dry enough. Don't want to mix things too much. So we have some white here. That's really going to be the last color we add, because we can just mix most of that blue, that lilac, to this white. Right, so I have a little bit of water on the brush already and got rid of almost all of the color on there, so no worries. So now let's first create a very, very light violet, right? A little bit of blue. It's closer to the blue side than the red, right? You see that right there? Oh, sorry about that. There we go. So I'm just pulling some of this purple that we had earlier. I'm just pulling it over. And that's the other thing about gouache is that you can kind of reactivate it. It doesn't dry immediately, but once it dries, you can still kind of reactivate it. I find that out of all the mediums, or between acrylic, watercolor, and gouache, not counting oil, it's the easiest to kind of reactivate. That's a great lilac. You can kind of see it. You can barely see it. So add a little bit more blue to it just to darken it up a bit and make it look, give it a little bit more tone and make it look more violet. There we go. That's just like that. That's a great tone right there. Right? You can make your adjustments if you just want to add a little bit more red, a little bit more blue. Right? There we go. I want it to be a little bit warmer, so I'm adding a little bit more red, just like that. That's actually a nice painting right there. A nice abstraction on our palette. Sometimes I like the way my palette looks, and it actually gives me ideas, believe it or not, right? Because that's where most of the mixing, and that's where the recipe is kind of coming alive, right? So we have this nice lilac now. We can add some detail, hooray, to this. And I'm just going to use kind of an upwardly brush stroke just to make it pointed at the end. See that? Just like that. And same thing here. Just like that. And if it's not exactly right, it's okay. No worries, because you can make your adjustments later on. That's the remarkable thing about this medium. It's very, very forgiving. I feel like the side of the label of any gouache paint should say it's going to be all right. Don't worry. No worries, right? Because you can make your adjustments later on. It's no big deal. It's very, very forgiving, isn't it? And here we can use this color to kind of separate the petals. Just like that. Not too much, right? Just kind of separate the petals like that. Very good. And then the base of it, it's got that color coming from those petals. So I'm going to go ahead and add that color there because that can be detailed later on. just to kind of define that edge a little more. And now this bottom flower is a little bit lighter, so we're going to use the same color, but with a little bit more white, right? Just a touch. You don't have to mix it too much. And same thing here. We just add some of those petals trailing up and away from us, just using the direction of the brush. That's all I'm doing. Just like that. And keep it nice and loose and nice and free. And here it's, it's a lot darker than we want it to be, but that's okay because now that it's dried, pretty dry, it dries pretty quickly, we can now add more white to it and make it lighter, right? So for example, we have this petal here that comes down. And this petal here comes down too. Here we go. A little bit of white at the bottom. It kind of meets this way. There. And that's going to give it some definition, really, especially when the light's hitting the petals in the background, right? And this one here too. Just like that. And so far, that's looking great. I love this one here too, because it's the softest of the two flowers, right? And really the definition, as far as I'm concerned, with this background, or sorry, the petals really, these flowers, is really just in the foreground petals. And I'm just going to very quickly add some blue here to this background. And because it's kind of trailing off into the distance here, we don't have to worry about it being too exact, too detailed. We can use broader brush strokes we want. Here we go. And we're almost there, right? And really, this is another fun part of painting, is just really having it come alive and seeing the whole process and just really enjoying it. And eventually it just starts to make sense why we did everything that we did, why we did it in that order, right? So here, I'm going to go ahead and finish off the stems by just making just a slightly different green that we've used, right? And that's just so that it's going to differentiate it from the other greens that we've used. So that way it's going to look like that is the stem. It's going to be obvious. So here I've just used a cooler green and some white. Like that. And that's also going to show us a little bit of the light reflection as well in that green. You see how that really comes alive? Isn't that cool? And that's just using slightly different green with a little bit of white. That's just making it, differentiating it between the background and the foreground. A little bit of warmth in it. So, and since we have this green, with everything else we've done, we can kind of add that really dark, those dark petals that we have, and we can make that sort of the finishing touch if we wanted. And that's gonna, so I'm making just a darker, maybe a dark purple would be great, right? For this. Or a dark blue, for example, right? There we go. Maybe a little bit more red. There we go. That's nice. Okay. And I can use this for the finishing touch, really, or finishing touches, because there's lots we can do. For example, we have all of these vines that just kind of trail down into the water, for example, right? We can paint the base of the flowers. Just kind of touch it up here and there. I like how it looks like it's like a crown, like the colorful bits of it look like it's a crown. Right? And then maybe some other vines that kind of twist around and just very lightly, not too hard, right? Just nice and easy with the brush, nice and light, and keep things nice and loose the way we've been painting it the whole time. Nice and easy. If you want to push it back a little bit more, just use more blue. Try to use it to define things a little bit more. Right, and now this is what I was planning to do last because it's probably the darkest part of most of the composition besides the water is really just these foreground petals. And I'm just going to use the very tip of the brush like that to give it some movement. You can see I barely touched it. Barely, just really light. Right? Just kind of like tickling the edge of the flower just a tad, like that. Same thing here, right on the base of this, right? Just using the side of the brush like that. And you want to know a secret, well, it's not so much a secret, but you want to know something really cool is if you feel like you messed up, right? It's very natural, you know, it happens. Oh, darn it, you know, this came up a little bit too high. It's easy to correct it, right? For example, this right here, right? This came up a little bit too high. That's okay. Remember, on the side of our paint, it says it's going to be all right. It's going to be okay. No worries. It should say that, right? I feel like it should say that on every bit of paint. Oh, by the way, the other cool thing is if you feel like you want to rub something out and kind of soften it, you can use the edge of the other end of your brush, of your paintbrush, and just kind of soften it that way. That's a really great way to soften. Sometimes I'll take a little bit of paint actually and just use it to rub something out and give it a few different bits of texture, for example, right? So just taking just a little bit of paint and just because it's so forgiving, right? So here's our mistake, right? It's no big deal. We can just correct it just like that. In fact, if we treat it like it's a welcome surprise, like I almost always talking about welcome surprises, actually, I like this better. So in a way, it's kind of good that it happened because adding a little bit of white to the tip of this brush enabled me to mix it a certain way. And now it looks like it's actually how I wanted it to look, a little bit more fluid, a little bit more organic, really. And I love that, right? And that really just happened because of a supposed mistake, and I'm just embracing it. And I'm just going to take some of the extra bit of paint off the edge of it and just use it to highlight just very lightly the edge of the stem like that. You don't have to do a lot, just a touch. That's the great thing about these highlights. And you can kind of go around and do the same thing to kind of finish it off if you wanted. So the choices are you do a little bit of both. You can highlight some of the lightest areas that we see So I'm going to take, and you don't have to use direct white because you can use just the lightest color that you have, like the light pink, for example, and you kind of just walk around, if you will, just kind of walk around the composition and see where some of the bits of light might be hitting in the reflection, right? And some of the petals might be reflecting, for example. And even here, where the light hits it directly on the side, right? And that's a good touch that we want to have. So, you know, you can kind of go around and doing this, and really that makes it come alive. In fact, some of the petals here, if you want to differentiate them a little bit more, we have a little bit more time left. We can add just a few bits of that light color, not too much because we don't want to muddy it. We love that pure color that's on there, that pure yellow, those pure greens, right? And you can actually, if you want to be bold, you can create a light reflection that comes down like that, right? Using a little bit of a dry brush, I can go ahead and just go right on top. Oh no, what happened? But look at what that does, right? Isn't that interesting? It looks like it's alive. I mean, it really looks natural. To clean off most of the brush, right? You take off most of the water. And if you want to soften that up, those areas that we just hit with that reflection, right? Just take out most of the water in the brush. All we have to do now is just soften it up. Just a tad, just here and there. Just like that. Maintaining some of that reflection on there. Isn't that beautiful? And then the last part, last but not least, I like to save this for last. Some of the darkest areas, that's going to really make it pop. It's going to give it some vibrancy and make it look very, very dynamic. And that's just adding just a darker color. The darkest color that you can mix, probably a dark purple. And if you want to add some sienna or umber, so here I'm adding just a touch of burnt umber, not too much. And if you mix those two colors together, you're going to get something very dark, but not like a pitch black or midnight black, because that's going to be too dark. I want it to be a little bit more natural. So I'm going to mix that color right here off to the side. First, I'm going to make that purple. There we go. And then just some of the umber on there, some of the burnt umber. And that's a nice dark color that we have, right? It's okay if some of the red and blues pure still on the tip of the brush. That's a beautiful color right there. And I prefer that instead of just a straight black. I think it looks better. It looks more natural. And there's some areas here where I'd love to give it a little bit more contrast. So for example, I want to make it a little bit more dramatic. I don't want to use it for the background here because it's pushing off into the distance. And I like that perspective that we're maintaining. So I'm going to use this just for some areas in the foreground, just to give it some depth, right? And also a little bit of shadow play. Some of the areas where some of the water is reflecting and some of the shadows are showing from the vines, for example, right? There we go. And it's just moving, it's coming alive. It's looking really great. And there's some areas where it's darker. Right, just create some shapes here. And just touches of it. You don't have to go overboard. There's some areas right here, for example, we can just probably the lightest touch you can have with the brush, just so that it gives it a little tiny bit of definition. And remember, you can flip that around, soften it with the edge of our paintbrush, the end of our paintbrush, right? And if you want to define certain things, for example, you can do that. And don't go overboard with this last bit, because it's easy to do that. The most important thing is that you just adding a few bits here and there. Think of it as the icing on the cake, if you will. You don't want to change the overall feel of the painting. And that's really what I'm going for really ultimately, is how this feels. It feels really good. And so just maybe a couple of more things here that I want to kind of embellish. And remember, we can take a little bit more of the pigment off this brush and use it to soften up certain things. All right. All right, so this feels really good, and we are approaching the end of our class. Can you believe it or not, just right on time? You know, I have to tell you, um, I'm so excited about our adventure here with Art Play because so many reasons. Just, processes like this and methods like this that I'm just, so excited to share with you guys. And I have to tell you, this has been so fun and so natural and so really spontaneous. This is one of my favorite paintings. It really is. I love how it feels. I love how it makes me feel. It makes me want to go outside and go to the botanical garden, paint some more. It also inspires me to bring my gouache paints with me. And I hope it inspired you. I hope that you want to paint more, especially with gouache, or just paint more in general. And that goes to show you, really, just we used one brush. Can you believe it? A single brush. And really just three colors. If you don't want to, we don't want to add the sienna and the white, really just three colors, just primary colors. And look at what you can do. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. I can't wait for their next class. I hope you had fun. I had a load of fun. I had so much fun. I'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us at Art Play.